The stagecoach lurched to a stop in front of the dusty general store, and William Kendrick watched from the saloon porch as a woman in a faded blue traveling dress stepped down with movements so careful they spoke of pain. It was late August, 1882, and Hecla, Montana had seen its share of mail order brides arriving to meet hopeful miners and ranchers, but something about this one made William set down his whiskey and stand up straighter. Maybe it was the way she held herself, spine rigid despite the obvious exhaustion, or maybe it was the haunted look in her eyes as she scanned the street, searching for someone she had never met. William had no business watching another man's bride arrive, but his feet carried him down the wooden steps anyway. He told himself it was simple curiosity, nothing more. The woman clutched a worn carpet bag in both hands, her knuckles white against the faded fabric. She wore no hat, and her dark auburn hair had been pulled into a practical bun that was coming loose after the long journey. Even from a distance, William could see the tremor in her hands. "You looking for someone, miss?" William heard himself ask, his boots crunching in the dry Montana dirt as he approached. Up close, he could see she was young, maybe 23 or 24, with green eyes that held shadows no woman that age should carry. "I am meant to meet Mr. Horace Dalton," she said, her voice surprisingly steady despite the fear he could read in every line of her body. "I am Margaret Monroe. We have been corresponding for 3 months." William felt his jaw tighten. He knew Horace Dalton, knew him better than he wanted to. The man owned a decent spread 5 miles south of town and had a reputation for working his horses too hard and his ranch hands harder. 2 men had quit in the past year, and both had left town quickly without saying much about why. William had his suspicions, but suspicions were not facts, and in a town like Hecla, you learned to mind your own business unless you had proof. "Horace is probably out at his ranch," William said carefully. "Did he know you were arriving today?" Margaret's composure cracked just slightly. "I sent a telegram 2 weeks ago with the date. Perhaps it did not reach him." William doubted that. The telegraph office in Hecla was small but reliable. More likely, Horace had simply not bothered to meet his bride, expecting her to find her own way to his ranch like she was a delivery of feed or equipment. The thought made William's blood simmer, but he kept his expression neutral. "I have a horse," William offered. "I could ride out and let him know you are here, or I could take you to the boarding house if you would rather rest after your journey." Relief flooded Margaret's features, and William realized she had been terrified of being stranded. "The boarding house, please. I would be grateful for a chance to wash the dust away before meeting my intended." William picked up her carpet bag, noting how light it was. Everything this woman owned in the world fit into one small bag. He led her down the main street of Hecla, past the assier's office, the blacksmith, and the general store. The boarding house sat at the end of the street, a 2-story wooden structure that Mrs. Chin kept spotlessly clean despite the constant battle against Montana dust. Mrs. Chin, a Chinese immigrant who had come to Montana during the mining boom and stayed after her husband died in a cave-in, met them at the door. She took one look at Margaret and ushered her inside with the kind of mothering efficiency that brooked no argument. "You look half dead, girl," Mrs. Chen said bluntly. "When did you last eat?" "Yesterday morning, I think," Margaret admitted, swaying slightly on her feet. William found himself reaching out to steady her, his hand on her elbow. Through the fabric of her sleeve, he could feel how thin she was, as if she had been living on scraps for longer than just the journey west. "Mrs. Chen, could you fix her a plate? I will cover the cost." "You will do no such thing," Mrs. Chen said firmly. "This one eats for free until she gets some meat on her bones. You go tell that Horace Dalton, his bride, is here, and he better come fetch her properly, not leave her to strangers." William nodded and turned to leave, but Margaret's voice stopped him. "Thank you, Mr. Kendrick. You have been very kind." He had not told her his name. She must have asked someone or perhaps heard it called out. "William is fine, miss. Welcome to Hecla." The ride out to the Dalton ranch gave William too much time to think. He tried to tell himself that Margaret Monroe was none of his concern. that she had made her choice to come west and marry a man she had never met, that plenty of mail-order marriages worked out just fine. But something nagged at him, some instinct honed by 30 years of reading men and situations. At 32, William had spent half his life working cattle ranches across Montana and Wyoming, and he had learned to trust his gut when it said something was wrong. The Dalton Ranch came into view as he crested a low rise. It was a decent spread, maybe 300 acres of grazing land with a sturdy house and barn. Horace kept things neat enough from the outside, but William had always found that men who kept their outward appearances perfect often hid the worst secrets. Horace was in the corral working a young horse, and William could see even from a distance that the man's methods were harsh. The horse's eyes showed too much white, and it shied away from Horace's approach with the kind of fear that came from repeated rough handling. "Horace!" William called out, keeping his voice level. Horace turned, and his weathered face split into a grin that did not reach his eyes. He was 45, with graying brown hair and the thick build of a man who had spent his life doing physical labor. "William Kendrick, what brings you out here? Your bride arrived in town today. She is at Mrs. Chen's boarding house waiting for you." Something flickered across Horace's face, too quick for William to read clearly, but it might have been irritation. "She is early. I told her to arrive next week. She said she sent a telegram 2 weeks ago with today's date." Horace waved a hand dismissively. "Well, she is here now. I suppose I should go collect her." He said it the way a man might talk about picking up a package, with no warmth or anticipation. William felt his dislike for Horace harden into something colder. "She has traveled a long way. Maybe show her some hospitality when you meet her." Horace's eyes narrowed. "I know how to treat a wife, Kendrick. You worry about your own affairs." William rode back to town with Horace's words ringing in his ears. The way the man had said wife made his skin crawl, as if Margaret were property he had purchased rather than a person he planned to build a life with. But William had delivered the message, done his good deed. What happened between Horace Dalton and Margaret Monroe was their business now, except he could not stop thinking about the fear in her eyes and the careful way she moved. Back in Hecla, William stopped at the boarding house. Mrs. Chen met him at the door, her expression troubled. "That girl is in bad shape, William. I helped her with a bath and her back." Mrs. Chen shook her head. "Someone hurt her bad. Old whip marks, all down her back and shoulders. Some of them are not that old either. A few months, maybe less." William felt rage bloom hot and immediate in his chest. "Did she say what happened?" "She would not talk about it. Just got very quiet and asked me not to mention it to Mr. Dalton." Mrs. Chen's dark eyes were sharp with concern. "I do not like this. That girl is running from something, and I am not sure she should be marrying a man like Horace Dalton." "Did she say where she came from?" "Ohio, a town called Marietta. She was a servant in a household there, I think, but she would not give details." William's mind raced. A servant with whip marks on her back. In 1882, slavery had been abolished for nearly 20 years, but that did not mean people had stopped finding ways to abuse those they held power over. Servants, especially women with no family or resources, were vulnerable to masters who believed themselves above the law. "Horace is coming to collect her," William said. "He should be here within the hour." Mrs. Chen's expression hardened. "I will make sure she is fed and rested before he arrives. And William, keep an eye on this situation. That girl is in trouble, I can feel it." William nodded and left the boarding house, but he did not go far. He found a spot on the saloon porch with a clear view of Mrs. Chen's door and settled in to wait. He told himself he was being paranoid, that Horace would arrive, meet his bride properly, and take her home to start their life together. But he could not shake the image of whip marks crisscrossing a young woman's back, could not forget the haunted look in Margaret's green eyes. An hour later, Horace rode up to the boarding house and went inside without knocking. William heard raised voices, though he could not make out the words. Then Horace emerged with Margaret following behind him, her carpetbag clutched in her hands. She had changed into a clean but equally worn dress, and her hair was neatly pinned. She looked pale but composed, and she did not meet William's eyes as Horace helped her onto his wagon with perfunctory efficiency. William watched them drive out of town, and every instinct he possessed screamed at him to follow, to intervene, to do something. But on what grounds? Margaret had come west to marry Horace. She had made that choice. William had no right to interfere in another man's business, especially when that business was the man's own wife. He tried to go about his life over the next few days. William worked his own small ranch on the northern edge of Hecla, tending to the 20 horses he bred and trained for sale to the cavalry and to ranchers looking for quality stock. It was good, honest work that usually gave him satisfaction, but now he found himself distracted, his thoughts constantly drifting to auburn hair and green eyes full of shadows. A week after Margaret's arrival, William rode into town for supplies and found Mrs. Chen waiting for him outside the general store. "You need to check on that girl, Mrs." Chen said without preamble. "Something is wrong. I know it." "What have you heard?" "Nothing. That is the problem. Horace came in for supplies 3 days ago. Alone. When Ed Miller at the general store asked after his new bride, Horace said she was settling in and too busy to come to town. But William, the way he said it..." Mrs. Chen shook her head. "I have a bad feeling." William had learned long ago to trust Mrs. Chen's instincts. "I will ride out there, make up an excuse to check on them. You do that, and William, if something is wrong, you bring that girl back to town. I do not care what the law says about husbands and wives. No one deserves to be hurt." William bought the supplies he needed, then took the long route back to his ranch, the one that happened to pass near the Dalton property. He had no real plan, no excuse ready if Horace asked what he was doing there. He just knew he needed to see for himself that Margaret was all right. As he approached the Dalton ranch, he heard shouting. William urged his horse to a faster pace, cresting the rise just in time to see Horace dragging Margaret out of the house by her arm. She stumbled, nearly falling, and William saw red. He dug his heels into his horse's flanks and thundered down the slope toward the ranch house. Horace looked up, startled, and released Margaret so quickly she did fall, landing hard in the dirt. "What the hell do you want, Kendrick?" Horace snarled. William dismounted in one fluid motion and positioned himself between Horace and Margaret. "I was riding by and heard shouting. Thought there might be trouble." "No trouble, just teaching my wife her place. Now get off my land." William ignored him and turned to Margaret. She was struggling to her feet, and he could see a fresh bruise blooming on her cheek. Their eyes met, and William saw terror there, but also a desperate, pleading hope. "Miss Monroe," William said carefully, "are you all right?" "Mrs. Dalton," Horace corrected harshly, "and she is fine. We had a small disagreement, nothing more. Now I said get off my land, Kendrick, before I get my rifle." William's hand dropped to the revolver at his hip, not drawing it but making his intentions clear. "I would like to hear from the lady herself that she is fine." Margaret's gaze darted between the two men, and William could see her calculating, trying to figure out the safest response. "I am fine, Mr. Kendrick," she said, but her voice was hollow, empty of conviction. "You see?" Horace took a step toward Margaret, and she flinched. That small movement, that instinctive recoil, told William everything he needed to know. "Now leave us be." William knew he was walking a dangerous line. If Margaret was legally married to Horace, William had no right to intervene in what the law considered a domestic matter. But damn the law if it meant leaving a woman to be brutalized by a man twice her size. "Mrs. Dalton," William said, keeping his tone gentle despite the rage simmering in his veins, "if you need help, you can come into town. Mrs. Chen would be happy to see you." "She does not need to go to town," Horace snapped. She has everything she needs here. Now, for the last time, Kendrick, get off my property before I make you. William met Margaret's eyes one more time, trying to communicate without words that he would help her if she asked. But she just stood there, arms wrapped around herself, trembling slightly in the late afternoon sun. Finally, William nodded and returned to his horse. I will be seeing you around, Dalton, William said, and the words were a promise and a warning all at once. He rode away slowly, glancing back several times. Each time, he saw Margaret still standing in the yard, watching him leave with an expression that would haunt his dreams for nights to come. William made it halfway back to his ranch before he turned around. He could not do it, could not just ride away and hope for the best when every instinct told him Margaret was in danger. Instead, he circled back, approaching the Dalton Ranch from the east, where a line of cottonwood trees provided cover. He left his horse tied in the trees and crept closer on foot, moving with the quiet skill he had learned hunting in these mountains. The sun was setting, painting the Montana sky in shades of orange and purple. William positioned himself where he could see the house and barn, and he waited. He felt slightly ridiculous, skulking in the bushes like some kind of spy, but the feeling evaporated when he heard Margaret scream. William was running before he made a conscious decision to move. He burst through the front door of the ranch house without knocking, his revolver drawn. The scene before him froze him in place for a heartbeat. Horace had Margaret bent over the kitchen table, one hand fisted in her hair, the other raising a leather strap. Her dress was torn at the shoulder, and William could see the edge of old scars, white against her pale skin. "Get away from her," William said, and his voice was deadly calm. Horace spun around, still holding the strap. "I told you to stay off my land, Kendrick. This is between me and my wife." "That woman is not your wife," William said. "You have not had time to get married proper, which means she is free to leave if she wants." Understanding dawned in Horace's eyes, followed quickly by fury. "We are common law married. She has been living in my house for over a week. That makes her mine." "Is that how you see her? As property you own?" William kept his gun trained on Horace, but spoke to Margaret. "Miss Monroe, do you want to leave with me?" Margaret lifted her head, tears streaming down her face. "Yes," she whispered. "Please, yes." Horace's face contorted with rage. "You are not taking her anywhere!" He lunged toward Margaret, and William fired. The bullet took Horace in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending him crashing into the table. He howled in pain and fury. But William was already moving, grabbing Margaret's hand and pulling her toward the door. "Get your bag," William commanded. "Anything you need, get it now." Margaret ran to the small bedroom off the kitchen and emerged seconds later with her worn carpet bag. They fled into the darkening evening, William keeping himself between Margaret and the house in case Horace recovered enough to grab his own gun. But no shots followed them as they ran for the cottonwood trees. William lifted Margaret onto his horse and swung up behind her. She was shaking so hard he worried she might fall, so he wrapped one arm around her waist to steady her as he urged his horse into a gallop. They rode hard for town, and William did not let himself think about what he had just done. He had shot a man, invaded his home, and taken the woman that man considered his wife. In the eyes of the law, William might very well be the criminal here, not Horace, but he could not bring himself to regret it, not with Margaret's thin body pressed against his chest, trembling with shock and relief and residual terror. They reached Hecla just as full dark settled over the town. William rode straight to Mrs. Chen's boarding house and half-carried Margaret inside. Mrs. Chen took one look at them and started barking orders, sending her young helper to fetch the doctor and hot water. "What happened?" Mrs. Chen demanded as she guided Margaret to a chair. "Horace was beating her," William said flatly. "I shot him in the shoulder and brought her back to town." Mrs. Chen's eyes widened, but she nodded. "You did right. Dr. Patterson will need to look at her, and then we will figure out what to do about Horace." Margaret's voice was small and broken when she spoke. "He will come for me. He said I belong to him. that he paid for me to come here, and I owed him. William knelt in front of her chair, gently taking her hands in his. They were ice cold, despite the warm August evening. You do not owe him anything. You are not property to be bought and sold. I will not let him hurt you again. You do not understand, Margaret said, and fresh tears spilled down her cheeks. I cannot go back to Ohio. I cannot go back there. But where else can I go? You can stay here, Mrs. Chen said firmly. In Hecla. You can stay in the boarding house until we figure out something more permanent. I have no money. I cannot pay you. Then you will work for your keep, Mrs. Chen said. I could use help running this place. Consider yourself employed if you want the job. William saw a flicker of hope kindle in Margaret's eyes, but it was quickly extinguished by fear. What if the law makes me go back to him? What if they say I have to be his wife? You never married him legally, William said. I checked before I came to his ranch. There is no record of a marriage certificate being filed. Whatever Horace claims, you are not legally bound to him. The doctor arrived then, a gruff older man named Henry Patterson, who had been practicing medicine in Hecla for 20 years. He shooed William out of the room and spent half an hour examining Margaret. When he emerged, his expression was grim. That girl has been through hell, doctor, Patterson said quietly. The bruises from Dalton are bad enough, but the scarring on her back, someone took a whip to her repeatedly over a long period of time, months, maybe years. She is severely malnourished and shows signs of prolonged abuse. William felt sick. Will she recover? Physically? With rest and proper food, yes. Mentally? Dr. Patterson shook his head. That is harder to say. Trauma like that leaves deep scars. She will need time, patience, and people who will not push her. She will have that here, Mrs. Chin said, appearing from the hallway. I will make sure of it. William stayed at the boarding house that night, sleeping in a chair by the front door in case Horace decided to come looking for Margaret. But the night passed quietly, and when morning came, William knew he needed to face the consequences of his actions. He saddled his horse and rode to the sheriff's office. Sheriff Tom Garrett was a fair man, if not always the most decisive. He listened to William's account of what had happened at the Dalton ranch, his weathered face impassive. You shot a man, William, Sheriff Garrett said when William finished. That is serious business. He was about to beat a defenseless woman with a strap. I did what I had to do to stop him. Horace might see it differently. He might say you broke into his home and stole his bride. She was never his bride, William said firmly. They never married legally. She came here under false pretenses, thinking she would have a better life, and instead she found another abuser. Sheriff Garrett's eyebrows rose. Another abuser? You know something about her past? William hesitated, then decided Margaret's story deserved to be told, if only to make sure she was protected. Mrs. Chen saw whip marks all over her back, old ones, from before she came to Montana. Whatever she was running from in Ohio, it was bad enough that she was willing to travel across the country to marry a stranger to escape it. The sheriff was quiet for a long moment. I will need to talk to Miss Monroe. Get her account of what happened. You can talk to her at Mrs. Chen's boarding house. But Sheriff, I need to know you will not force her to go back to Horace. That depends on what Horace does. If he wants to press charges against you for shooting him or against her for breach of contract, I might not have a choice. William left the sheriff's office with a heavy heart. He knew Sheriff Garrett was right. The law had its processes and procedures, and William had to trust that justice would prevail. But he also knew that the law was not always just, especially when it came to women's rights. In 1882, women had few legal protections, and men like Horace Dalton often got away with abuse because society considered it a private matter. He returned to the boarding house and found Margaret sitting in the kitchen, helping Mrs. Chen prepare breakfast. She looked better in the morning light, though the bruise on her cheek had darkened to a deep purple. She was wearing a simple gray dress that Mrs. Chen must have lent her, and her hair was braided down her back. "Good morning," William said carefully, not wanting to startle her. Margaret looked up and managed a small smile. "Good morning, Mr. Kendrick. Mrs. Chen told me you stayed all night to watch over the house." "Thank you." "William," he corrected gently. "And you do not need to thank me. I did what anyone should have done." "But most would not have," Margaret said quietly. "Most would have said it was not their business and looked the other way." William pulled out a chair and sat down across from her. "Can I ask you something?" Margaret's hands stilled on the bread dough she was kneading, and wariness crept into her expression. "I suppose. Who hurt you? Before you came to Montana, I mean. Who put those scars on your back?" Margaret's face went pale, and for a moment William thought she would refuse to answer. But then she spoke, her voice so quiet he had to lean forward to hear. "My employer in Ohio, Mr. Cornelius Hartwell. I was a servant in his household for 5 years, starting when I was 18. At first, it was just verbal abuse when I made mistakes. Then it became physical. He had a cane he kept in his study, and he used it on the servants if we displeased him. By the end, I was being beaten at least once a week for the smallest infractions." William felt rage building in his chest again, but he kept his voice calm. "Why did you not leave?" "Where would I have gone? I had no family, no money, no references. Mr. Hartwell made sure I understood that if I tried to leave, he would tell every household in Marietta that I was a thief and a liar. I would never work again." Margaret's hands were shaking now, but she kept kneading the dough mechanically. "When I saw Horace's advertisement for a mail-order bride, it seemed like a miracle, a chance to escape, to start fresh somewhere. Mr. Hartwell could not reach me. I never thought that you would end up in the same situation," William finished quietly. "Horace seemed kind in his letters. He wrote about his ranch, about wanting a wife to share his life with. He said he was lonely and wanted companionship. I thought perhaps here in Montana I could finally be safe." A single tear rolled down Margaret's cheek. "I was such a fool." "You were not a fool," William said firmly. "You were brave. You did what you had to do to survive, and you had every right to hope for better. What Horace did was not your fault." Mrs. Chen bustled in from the back room and took in the scene with sharp eyes. "That is enough heavy talk before breakfast. Margaret, you finish that bread while I fry some eggs. William, make yourself useful and set the table." They fell into a companionable routine, and William was struck by how natural it felt to be working alongside Margaret in the kitchen. She moved efficiently despite her obvious exhaustion, and he could see the competence that came from years of service work. But he also saw the way she flinched when he moved too quickly, the way she positioned herself to keep both doors in sight at all times. This was a woman who had learned to always be ready to flee or defend herself. Over breakfast, William told Margaret about his conversation with the sheriff. She listened with growing anxiety, her food growing cold on her plate. "What will happen if Mr. Dalton presses charges?" she asked. "I do not know," William admitted, "but I will not let you face it alone. If you need a lawyer, I will pay for one. If you need somewhere safe to stay, my ranch is available. Whatever it takes, Margaret, I will make sure you are protected." "Why?" The question was blunt, almost accusatory. "You do not know me. Why would you risk so much for a stranger?" William considered his answer carefully. He was not entirely sure himself why he felt so compelled to help this woman. Part of it was simple decency, the belief that strong men had a duty to protect those who could not protect themselves. But there was something more, something he was not quite ready to name. "Because it is the right thing to do," he said finally, "and because I believe everyone deserves a chance at a life without fear." Margaret held his gaze for a long moment, and William saw something shift in her expression. Trust, tentative and fragile, but there nonetheless. The sheriff came by that afternoon to take Margaret's statement. She recounted the events at the Dalton ranch with quiet composure, though William noticed her hands clenched in her lap whenever she mentioned Horace's name. Sheriff Garrett wrote everything down, his expression neutral. "Has Mr. Dalton come to see you?" Margaret asked when she finished. "Not yet," the sheriff said. "I rode out to his ranch this morning. He was there, nursing his shoulder wound. Said he would come to town when he was ready to press charges." "Against whom?" William asked sharply. "Against me for stopping him from beating Margaret, or against her for having the audacity to try and escape?" Sheriff Garrett held up a hand. "I am just telling you what I found. Horace did not specify what charges he might bring. He just said he needed time to think." After the sheriff left, Mrs. Chen pulled William aside. "That man is planning something. I know his type. He is not going to let this go quietly." "I know," William agreed. "I will keep watch, and I will make sure Margaret is never alone where Horace could get to her." Over the next few days, William became a constant presence at the boarding house. He helped Mrs. Chen with repairs around the property, giving him an excuse to stay close. He also started teaching Margaret how to shoot, taking her out to the edge of town where they could practice without drawing too much attention. "I have never held a gun before," Margaret said nervously, as William handed her a small revolver. "Then it is time you learned," William said. "Out here you need to be able to defend yourself. The law can only do so much." He stood behind her, guiding her hands into the proper position. He was acutely aware of her nearness, the faint scent of lavender soap in her hair, the way she fit perfectly in the circle of his arms. William forced himself to focus on the lesson. "Keep both eyes open," he instructed. "Focus on your target, not the sight. And when you fire, squeeze the trigger gently. Do not pull it." Margaret's first shot went wide, the recoil making her stumble back into William's chest. He steadied her automatically, his hands on her shoulders. "Try again," he encouraged. "You will get the feel for it." By the end of the hour, Margaret was hitting the target more often than not. William saw confidence blooming in her expression, replacing some of the fear she had worn like a cloak since arriving in Montana. "Thank you," she said as they walked back toward town, the gun safely tucked into the holster William had bought for her. "For teaching me. For everything." "You do not need to keep thanking me," William said. "But I do. You have given me something I have not had in years. Hope. The belief that maybe I can build a life here, a real life where I am not afraid all the time." Margaret stopped walking and turned to face him. "Why are you really doing all this, William? And please do not say it is just because it is the right thing to do. There is more to it than that." William met her gaze and saw the intelligence there, the determination. This was not a woman who would be satisfied with platitudes. She deserved the truth, even if he was not entirely sure what that truth was himself. "When I saw you step off that stagecoach," William said slowly, "something in me recognized something in you. I have spent most of my life alone, Margaret. I have friends, I have work that I love, but I have never had someone to share it with. Never found a woman who made me want to try. And then you arrived, and I looked into your eyes and saw strength and courage and a kind of beauty that has nothing to do with appearances and everything to do with spirit. I want to help you because you deserve help. But I also want to know you, to give you time to heal, and then if you are willing, to see if maybe we could build something together." Margaret's eyes widened, and for a moment William feared he had overstepped, revealed too much too soon. But then she smiled, really smiled, and it transformed her entire face. "I would like that," she said softly. "I am not ready yet. I have too much fear still, too many scars. But the idea that someday I might be ready, that someone like you might want to wait for me, that means more than you can possibly know." They walked the rest of the way back to town in comfortable silence, and William felt something settle in his chest. Hope, maybe, or the beginning of something deeper. 2 weeks after Margaret arrived in Hecla, Horace Dalton finally made his move. He rode into town with a lawyer from Helena, a slick-dressed man named Arthur Simmons, who specialized in property disputes. They went straight to the sheriff's office, and within an hour, Sheriff Garrett was knocking on Mrs. Chen's door. "Horace is pressing charges," the sheriff said without preamble, "against William for assault and attempted theft, and against Margaret for breach of contract and theft of property." "What property?" Margaret asked, her face pale. "Horace claims you stole from him before you left. Some jewelry that belonged to his late mother. He says it is worth $500. "That is a lie!" Margaret's voice shook with outrage. "I took nothing but my own belongings. He is making this up to force me back." "I believe you," Sheriff Garrett said, "but I have to investigate the claim. Horace is also arguing that you are common law married, that you agreed to be his wife and lived in his house as his wife, which means you are legally bound to him." William stepped forward. "We are not letting her go back there. I do not care what some lawyer from Helena says." "It might not be up to you, William," the sheriff said grimly. "Judge Morrison is coming through town next week to hold court. This will all be decided then. Until that time, I need you both to stay in town where I can find you if needed." After the sheriff left, Margaret sank into a chair, her composure crumbling. "They are going to make me go back to him. I know they are. The law always sides with men in these situations." "Not always," Mrs. Chen said firmly. "We are going to fight this. I know every person in this town, and I can tell you right now that most folks do not have much love for Horace Dalton. We will make sure Judge Morrison hears the truth about what kind of man he is." Over the next week, William and Mrs. Chen worked tirelessly to gather support for Margaret. They spoke to the ranch hands who had quit working for Horace, convincing them to testify about the cruel treatment they had witnessed. They collected statements from townspeople who had seen Horace's temper firsthand. Dr. Patterson agreed to testify about Margaret's injuries and the old scars on her back. William also sent telegrams to Ohio, trying to gather information about Cornelius Hartwell and Margaret's time in his employ. It was a long shot, but if they could prove that Margaret had been fleeing abuse, it might help her case. Margaret herself showed a core of steel that William found himself admiring more each day. She refused to hide or cower. Instead, she threw herself into work at the boarding house, helping Mrs. Chen and making herself useful to the community. She volunteered at the schoolhouse, helping the teacher with the younger children. She assisted at the general store when they needed an extra pair of hands. Within days, Margaret Monroe had endeared herself to half of Hecla, and people started talking about how unfair it would be if she were forced to return to Horace Dalton. In the evenings, after the day's work was done, William and Margaret would sit on the porch of the boarding house and talk. She told him about her childhood in a Philadelphia orphanage, about the loneliness and hunger that had defined her early years. She told him about her dreams of having a home of her own, a place where she could feel safe and loved. William shared his own stories. He told her about growing up on his father's ranch in Wyoming, about learning to ride before he could walk properly. He told her about his parents' deaths 10 years ago in a flash flood, and how he had sold the Wyoming property and come to Montana to start fresh. He talked about his horses, the pride he took in breeding and training animals that were known across the territory for their quality. "I would like to see your ranch," Margaret said one evening as the sun set over the mountains. "If you would not mind showing me." "I would like that very much," William said. "Maybe after the hearing, when things are settled." "You are very confident that things will work out in my favor," Margaret observed. "I have to be," William said simply, "because the alternative is unacceptable." Margaret reached over and took his hand, her fingers threading through his. It was the first time she had initiated physical contact, and William felt the significance of that gesture down to his bones. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for believing in me, for fighting for me. I have never had anyone do that before." William squeezed her hand gently. "You deserve someone who will fight for you. You deserve all the good things you have been denied." They sat like that until full dark, hands clasped, watching the stars emerge in the vast Montana sky. And William thought that even if he had known from the beginning what trouble would come from helping Margaret, he would have made the same choice every time. Some things were worth fighting for. Judge Morrison arrived in Hecla on a Tuesday morning, an imposing man in his 60s with silver hair and sharp blue eyes that seemed to miss nothing. Court was held in the saloon, the only building in town large enough to accommodate all the people who wanted to attend. William was not surprised by the turnout. The story of Margaret's arrival and Horace's subsequent claim had become the talk of the town. Horace sat at one table with his lawyer, his shoulder still bandaged, but his expression confident. Margaret sat at another table with a lawyer that William had hired from Helena, a woman named Catherine Brennan, who had a reputation for taking on difficult cases. Catherine was 40, with iron gray hair and a no-nonsense manner that immediately put William at ease. The proceedings started with Horace's lawyer, Arthur Simmons, laying out his client's case. He argued that Margaret had entered into a verbal contract to marry Horace when she agreed to come to Montana as his mail-order bride. He claimed that she had lived in Horace's house as his wife, which established a common law marriage. He presented the advertisement that Horace had placed seeking a bride and the letters that Margaret had written in response. This was a clear agreement, Simmons argued. Miss Monroe committed to becoming Mrs. Dalton. She cannot simply change her mind because she finds the reality of frontier life more difficult than she imagined. And when she left, she stole valuable jewelry, adding theft to her breach of contract. Catherine Brennan rose to respond, and her voice cut through the murmuring crowd like a knife. Your Honor, the defense will show that Miss Monroe was subjected to physical abuse by Mr. Dalton, that she never legally married him, and that the so-called stolen jewelry never existed. Furthermore, we will demonstrate that Mr. Dalton misrepresented himself in his correspondence, essentially committing fraud to lure Miss Monroe to Montana under false pretenses. Judge Morrison listened to both opening statements, then called the first witness. Horace took the stand and told his version of events. According to him, Margaret had arrived willingly, had agreed to be his wife, and had lived peacefully in his home until she became hysterical one day and fled with William Kendrick, stealing his mother's jewelry on the way out. She was emotional, unpredictable, Horace said, shaking his head sadly. I tried to be patient with her, but she would fly into rages over nothing. When I tried to calm her down, she would claim I was attacking her. I believe she may be mentally unstable. William watched Margaret's face as Horace spoke, saw the way she paled at the blatant lies, but she held her composure, her hands folded calmly in her lap. Catherine's cross-examination was brutal. She asked Horace to describe the jewelry in detail. He claimed it was a necklace with rubies, but when pressed for specifics, his description kept changing. She asked why he had not reported the theft immediately. Horace claimed he had been too injured and upset. She asked about his shoulder wound, and Horace admitted that William Kendrick had shot him. Mr. Kendrick burst into my home without invitation and shot me, Horace said. Then he took my wife and left me bleeding. Why do you think Mr. Kendrick did that? Catherine asked. I believe he wanted Margaret for himself. He was jealous that she had chosen me. Catherine nodded thoughtfully. So your testimony is that Mr. Kendrick, a respected rancher with no history of violence, suddenly decided to invade your home and shoot you out of romantic jealousy. That is what happened. We will see about that, Catherine said. No further questions. The next witness was William himself. He took the stand and told the truth about what he had seen and heard at the Dalton Ranch. He described finding Horace with a leather strap raised to strike Margaret, described the torn dress and the visible scars on her back. I fired my weapon to stop an assault in progress, William said clearly. I would do the same again if faced with the same situation. Simmons tried to shake William's testimony on cross-examination, suggesting that William had misinterpreted what he saw, that perhaps Horace and Margaret had simply been having a marital dispute. But William held firm. There is no dispute that justifies a man beating a woman with a strap, William said. And Margaret was not his wife. They never married legally. The afternoon session brought more witnesses. Dr. Patterson testified about Margaret's injuries and the old scars on her back. Two former ranch hands testified about Horace's temper and cruel treatment of employees and animals. Mrs. Chen testified about Margaret's condition when she first arrived and the fear in her eyes whenever Horace's name was mentioned. Then it was Margaret's turn to take the stand. Catherine guided her through her testimony with gentle efficiency. Margaret described her life in Ohio, working for Cornelius Hartwell. She spoke about the beatings, the constant fear, the desperate hope that had led her to respond to Horace's advertisement. "I thought I was coming to Montana to start a new life," Margaret said, her voice steady despite the emotion William could see in her eyes. "I thought I would marry a kind man who wanted a partner. Instead, I found myself in the same situation I had fled. When Mr. Dalton raised that strap to hit me, all I could think was that I would die before I let another man abuse me that way." Simmons's cross-examination was aggressive. He tried to paint Margaret as a woman of questionable morals who had used Horace to escape her circumstances and then abandoned him when she found a wealthier prospect in William. He questioned why she had not gone to the sheriff if she felt threatened. He suggested that she was lying about the abuse to avoid fulfilling her commitment. But Margaret did not break. She answered each question calmly, meeting Simmons's gaze without flinching. And William saw the jury of townspeople watching her, saw their expressions shift from skepticism to sympathy to outright support. The final witness was a surprise. Sheriff Garrett took the stand and revealed that he had received a response to a telegram he had sent to the sheriff in Marietta, Ohio. Cornelius Hartwell had been arrested 2 months ago on charges of assault after another servant came forward with complaints of abuse. The investigation had revealed a pattern of violence stretching back years, including multiple former servants who testified to being beaten regularly. "Mr. Hartwell is currently awaiting trial," Sheriff Garrett said. "The prosecutor in Ohio wanted me to pass along that if Miss Monroe is willing to testify against him, it would strengthen their case significantly." This revelation sent murmurs through the crowd. Simmons objected, arguing that events in Ohio had no bearing on the current case, but Judge Morrison overruled him. "It establishes a pattern," the judge said. "It shows that Miss Monroe had legitimate reasons for fleeing her previous situation and that her claims of abuse have credibility." After all the testimony was heard, Judge Morrison called for closing arguments. Simmons reiterated his claim that Margaret had broken a contract and stolen property. Catherine Brennan argued passionately that Margaret had been lured to Montana under false pretenses and had every right to refuse to marry a man who had immediately shown himself to be violent and abusive. "The law should protect victims, not force them back into the hands of their abusers," Catherine said. "Miss Monroe came to Montana hoping for a better life. She should not be punished for having the courage to escape when that hope proved false." Judge Morrison took less than an hour to reach his verdict. When court reconvened, he looked stern but not unkind. "I have considered all the testimony and evidence presented," he said. "On the charge of theft, I find no credible evidence that Miss Monroe took anything belonging to Mr. Dalton. The claim of stolen jewelry is dismissed. On the question of whether a legal marriage exists between Miss Monroe and Mr. Dalton, I find that it does not. No marriage certificate was filed, and cohabitation of less than 2 weeks does not establish a common law marriage, particularly when that cohabitation was marked by violence and coercion. Miss Monroe is free to make her own choices about her future." Relief flooded through William so intensely he felt dizzy. Beside him, Margaret was crying silently, her shoulders shaking. "As for Mr. William Kendrick," Judge Morrison continued, "while I cannot officially condone taking the law into one's own hands, I find that his actions were justified given the circumstances. He will not face charges for assault. However, Mr. Kendrick, in the future, I would advise you to involve the proper authorities before resorting to violence." "Yes, Your Honor," William said. Judge Morrison turned his attention to Horace, and his expression hardened. "Mr. Dalton, I am fining you $100 for placing false advertisements and wasting this court's time with spurious theft charges. Furthermore, I am issuing an order that you are to have no contact with Miss Monroe. If you approach her or attempt to communicate with her in any way, you will be arrested and jailed. Do you understand? Horace's face was purple with rage, but he nodded jerkily. Yes, Your Honor. Then this court is adjourned. The saloon erupted in chatter as people stood and began filing out. William turned to Margaret and found her already looking at him, tears still streaming down her face, but a brilliant smile on her lips. We won, she said, as if she could not quite believe it. You won, William corrected. You stood up for yourself and told the truth, and justice prevailed. Margaret threw her arms around him, and William caught her, holding her close as she cried against his chest. He was aware of people watching, probably gossiping about the nature of their relationship, but he did not care. All that mattered was the woman in his arms and the fact that she was finally, truly free. Over the next few months, William watched Margaret transform. The haunted look gradually faded from her eyes, replaced by genuine joy and laughter. She continued working at the boarding house, but she also started helping William at his ranch a few days a week. He taught her about horses, and she proved to have a natural gift for working with the animals. The horses seemed to sense her gentleness and responded to her in ways that surprised even William. They took things slowly, both aware that Margaret needed time to heal from years of abuse. Their courtship was unconventional by any standard. Instead of formal dances and chaperone visits, they spent their time working side by side, talking about everything and nothing, building a foundation of trust and friendship that William knew would last a lifetime. One evening in late October, they were sitting on the porch of William's ranch house, watching the first snow of the season dust the mountains. Margaret had her head resting on his shoulder, and William had his arm around her. It felt perfect, and he found himself thinking about the future with a clarity he had never experienced before. Margaret, he said quietly, I have something I want to ask you. She lifted her head to look at him, her green eyes curious. What is it? I know we have not been courting long by traditional standards, and I know you have been through more than anyone should have to endure. But I also know how I feel about you, and I do not want to wait to tell you. William took her hand in his. I love you. I love your strength and your courage. I love the way you laugh when one of the horses does something silly. I love the way you hum while you work and the way you always make sure everyone around you has eaten before you take food for yourself. I love everything about you, and I want to spend the rest of my life showing you what it means to be truly loved and cherished. Margaret's eyes were bright with tears, but they were good tears this time. William, I love you too. I think I started falling in love with you the day you rode up to Horace's ranch and put yourself between me and danger. No one had ever done that for me before, and every day since, you have shown me what real kindness looks like, what real strength looks like. You have given me the time and space to heal, and you have never asked for anything in return. I am asking now, William said. Margaret Monroe, will you marry me? Will you be my wife, not because society expects it or because you have no other options, but because you choose to, because you want to build a life with me? Yes, Margaret said without hesitation. Yes, I will marry you. I choose you, William Kendrick. I choose this life we are building together. William kissed her then, gently at first and then with all the love and passion he had been holding back for months. When they finally broke apart, both were breathless and smiling. They were married in December in a simple ceremony at the church in Hecla with Mrs. Chen and Sheriff Garrett standing as witnesses. Margaret wore a new dress that Mrs. Chen had helped her sew, deep blue wool that brought out the color of her eyes. William wore his best suit and felt his heart might burst from happiness as he watched Margaret walk down the aisle toward him. The wedding reception was held at the boarding house, with half the town in attendance. People brought food and gifts, celebrating the union of two people who had become beloved members of the community. Someone produced a fiddle, and there was dancing late into the night. When they finally returned to William's ranch, Now their ranch. Margaret paused at the threshold. William understood without words. He swept her into his arms and carried her inside, both of them laughing. Welcome home, Mrs. Kendrick, William said as he set her down. Home, Margaret repeated softly. I like the sound of that. Their wedding night was tender and patient. William was careful with Margaret, aware that physical intimacy might bring back painful memories. But she surprised him with her eagerness, her willingness to trust him with her body as she already trusted him with her heart. They came together slowly, discovering each other with wonder and joy. And when Margaret cried afterward, William knew they were tears of happiness. The first year of their marriage brought challenges and joys in equal measure. The ranch required constant work, especially as they expanded the horse breeding operation. Margaret proved to be an invaluable partner, handling the business side of things with an efficiency that freed William to focus on training. They built new corrals and expanded the barn. They hired 2 ranch hands, young men who were grateful for fair treatment and honest wages. In the spring, Margaret received a letter from the prosecutor in Ohio. Cornelius Hartwell had been convicted on multiple counts of assault and sentenced to 10 years in prison. Several other former servants had come forward after Margaret's testimony at the trial in Montana became public knowledge. The prosecutor thanked Margaret for her courage in speaking out and said that her testimony had inspired others to do the same. Margaret cried when she read the letter, but William knew these were tears of relief and closure. The man who had tormented her for so long would not hurt anyone else for a very long time. They also heard through the town gossip network that Horace Dalton had sold his ranch and left Montana. Some said he had gone to California, others thought he had headed to Arizona. Either way, he was gone from their lives, and good riddance. In the summer of their first year of marriage, Margaret discovered she was pregnant. William was overjoyed, but he also worried about Margaret's health given all she had been through. Dr. Patterson assured them both that Margaret was strong and healthy, and that there was no reason to expect complications. Their son was born in March of 1884 during a late spring snowstorm that kept Dr. Patterson snowed in at the ranch for 3 days after the birth. They named him James after William's father. He was a healthy baby with his mother's green eyes and his father's dark hair, and William fell in love all over again, watching Margaret cradle their son. Motherhood transformed Margaret in ways William had not expected. She was fierce in her protectiveness, but also gentle and patient. She sang to James constantly, lullabies she remembered from her own childhood, and new songs she made up as she went along. And slowly, as she gave their son the love and security she had never known herself, William saw the last of Margaret's shadows fade away. 2 years later, they had a daughter. They named her Catherine, after the lawyer who had defended Margaret in court. Catherine had her father's dark eyes and her mother's auburn hair, and she was stubborn and fearless from the moment she entered the world. The ranch prospered over the years. William's horses became famous throughout Montana and beyond for their quality and temperament. They had a waiting list of buyers, and William was able to be selective about where his animals went, ensuring they would be treated well. Margaret started a small school on the ranch for the children of nearby homesteaders. She taught reading, writing, and arithmetic in the mornings, while William and the ranch hands worked the horses. In the afternoons, she would help with the ranch work, a full partner in every aspect of their lives together. They added onto the house as their family grew, building more bedrooms and a large kitchen where Margaret loved to cook and bake. The house became a gathering place for neighbors and friends, always full of laughter and warmth. On their 10th wedding anniversary, William and Margaret rode up to a high meadow on the ranch where wildflowers bloomed in profusion. They had left the children with Mrs. Chen for the day, wanting some time alone together. "Do you remember the first time we came up here?" Margaret asked as they dismounted and spread a blanket on the ground. "I remember everything about our life together," William said, pulling her down to sit beside him. "Every moment has been a gift." Margaret leaned against him, and they sat in comfortable silence, watching clouds drift across the vast Montana sky. Finally, Margaret spoke. "I used to think my scars defined me. Those marks on my back, the fear that lived in my heart for so long. I thought that was all I would ever be, a broken thing that had survived but would never truly live. She turned to look at William, her eyes shining with love. You showed me I was wrong. You loved me through the healing, and you helped me see that my scars are not what define me. My choices define me, my courage, the life we have built together. Thank you for that, William. Thank you for seeing who I could become and having the patience to wait while I became her. William cupped her face in his hands and kissed her softly. You were always that person, Margaret. You were always strong and courageous and beautiful. I just had the privilege of being there when you finally believed it yourself. They made love in the meadow that afternoon, surrounded by wildflowers and birdsong, and afterward they talked about their dreams for the future. They wanted to expand the school Margaret had started, maybe build a proper schoolhouse that could serve the whole area. They talked about teaching James and Catherine to run the ranch, passing on the legacy they were building. They talked about growing old together, about watching their children have children of their own. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, William pulled Margaret to her feet. We should head back before it gets dark. Mrs. Chen will have our heads if we are late for dinner. Margaret laughed, that full, joyous laugh that never failed to make William's heart sing. Then we had better hurry. You know how she gets when people do not appreciate her cooking. They rode back to the ranch, hand in hand, their horses walking side by side. The house came into view as darkness fell, windows glowing with lamplight. William could see James and Catherine on the porch, waiting for their parents to return. This was his life now, was his life. Not the solitary existence he had known before Margaret arrived, but something richer and fuller than he had ever imagined possible. A family, a home, a love that had grown from tragedy and trauma into something unshakable. Margaret had arrived in Hecla, Montana, as a mail-order bride fleeing one abusive situation, only to nearly fall into another. She had carried scars, visible and invisible, that spoke of years of suffering. But she had also carried hope and courage and a determination to build a better life. William had traced those scars on their wedding night, his fingers gentle on her skin as he made a silent promise to spend his life ensuring she never bore such marks again. It was a vow he had kept every day since and would keep for all the days to come. As they dismounted and their children ran to greet them, William looked at Margaret and saw her smile, saw the peace and happiness that radiated from her. The woman who had stepped off that stagecoach years ago, frightened and alone, was gone. In her place was Margaret Kendrick, beloved wife, devoted mother, successful businesswoman, and the absolute center of William's world. That night, after the children were asleep and the ranch was quiet, William and Margaret sat on their porch as they had done countless times before. Margaret leaned her head on William's shoulder, and he wrapped his arm around her, holding her close. I love you, Margaret whispered into the darkness. I love you too, William replied. Today, tomorrow, and all the days after. And as stars filled the Montana sky above them, William thought about the twists of fate that had brought them together. A mail-order bride advertisement, a chance encounter on a dusty street, a decision to intervene when he could have walked away. Each moment had been a thread in the tapestry of their lives, weaving together into something beautiful and lasting. The years continued to roll by, bringing both joys and sorrows as all years do. Mrs. Chen passed away peacefully in her sleep at the age of 75, and Margaret wept at her funeral, mourning the woman who had been the first to offer her shelter and kindness in Montana. They took over the boarding house, running it as Mrs. Chen had, as a place of refuge for those in need. Sheriff Garrett retired and was replaced by a younger man, but Garrett remained a close friend, often stopping by the ranch to play chess with William and share stories with the children about the old days. James grew into a fine young man, tall and strong like his father, with his mother's compassionate heart. He took to ranch work naturally, and by the time he was 20, he was running the horse breeding operation with skill and innovation that made William proud. Catherine was equally capable but more interested in the business side of things. She had her mother's head for numbers and her father's ability to read people, and together the siblings made a formidable team. When James was 23, he married a homesteader's daughter named Sarah, and they had their first child a year later. William became a grandfather to a baby boy named Thomas, and he marveled at how time had flown. It seemed like yesterday that he was holding his own son for the first time, and now here was his grandson, tiny and perfect. Catherine married a few years later to a lawyer from Helena, a good man named Robert who treated her as an equal partner and supported her ambitions. They had twin daughters who were as stubborn and fearless as their mother had been. The ranch continued to prosper across the decades. They weathered droughts and harsh winters, economic downturns, and the changing times. The Wild West of William's youth gradually gave way to a more settled, civilized Montana, with better roads and regular train service. But the ranch remained a constant, a piece of living history and a testament to what could be built with hard work and love. On their 30th wedding anniversary, William and Margaret hosted a celebration at the ranch. All their children and grandchildren were there, along with friends from across the territory. There was music and dancing, food and laughter. As the party wound down and guests began to depart, William found Margaret standing at the edge of the porch, looking out at the land they had built their life on. "What are you thinking about?" William asked, coming to stand beside her. "Everything," Margaret said softly. "How far we have come. How blessed we have been." She turned to him, and even at 53, she was beautiful to William, perhaps more so than ever, because now her beauty was layered with wisdom and experience. "Do you remember the day we met?" "Of course. You stepped off that stagecoach looking like you were about to face a firing squad." Margaret laughed. "I felt that way. I was so scared, William, scared that I had made a terrible mistake, that I would never be safe, that I would spend the rest of my life running from one bad situation to another." "But you did not run," William said. "You stood your ground. You fought for yourself." "Because you fought for me first," Margaret said. "You showed me I was worth fighting for. That changed everything." William pulled her into his arms, holding her close as stars began to appear in the darkening sky. "We saved each other. I think I was just going through the motions of living before you came. You gave me purpose, gave me a reason to build something lasting." They stood like that for a long time, two people who had found each other against impossible odds and built a love that would endure for all time. In their later years, William and Margaret gradually turned over the running of the ranch to James and Catherine, though they remained active and involved well into their 60s. They traveled some, taking the train to see places Margaret had only read about in books. They visited the ocean in California, marveling at the endless expanse of water. They went to Denver and San Francisco, experiencing the bustle of cities that were rapidly modernizing. But they always came back to Montana, to the ranch, to the life they had built. Home was not just a place, but a feeling. And for both of them, home was wherever they were together. William was 72 when he finally had to admit his body was not as young as his spirit. His joints ached in the mornings, and he moved more slowly than he once had. But his mind was sharp, and his love for Margaret had not diminished one bit over the decades. Margaret, at 70, was still vibrant and active, helping with the grandchildren and great-grandchildren who seemed to multiply every year. She had become the matriarch of not just their family, but of the entire community, a woman people came to for advice and comfort. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching yet another Montana sunset, Margaret took William's hand. "I want to tell you something," she said. "Something I have never told anyone, not even you." William looked at her in surprise. After 50 years of marriage, he thought they had shared everything. "What is it?" "The day I stepped off that stagecoach in Hecla, I was not just scared, I was suicidal. I had decided that if things did not work out with Horace, if I found myself in another abusive situation, I would not survive it. I could not survive it. I had a bottle of laudanum in my bag, and I planned to take it all if I needed to. William felt his heart clench. Margaret, let me finish, she said gently. I need to tell you this. When I met Horace and realized what he was, I went back to the boarding house and took out that bottle. I held it in my hands and seriously considered ending everything right there. But then I thought about you, about the stranger who had been kind to me for no reason other than basic human decency. I thought about how you had looked at me, not with pity or lust, but with respect. And I decided to wait one more day, just one more day, to see what might happen. Tears were streaming down William's face now. I am so glad you waited. So am I, Margaret said. That one day became another day, and another, until suddenly 50 years had passed, and I had lived an entire beautiful life I never would have known if I had given up. You saved me, William, not just from Horace, but from myself. And I wanted you to know that, to understand how profound your impact on my life has been. William pulled her close, holding her as he had held her so many times before. You saved me too, he whispered. In every way a person can be saved. William Kendrick passed away peacefully in his sleep 3 years later, at the age of 75. He had been working with the horses earlier that day, teaching his great-grandson the finer points of training, and he had seemed tired but happy. Margaret found him that evening, lying on their bed with a slight smile on his face, as if he had welcomed whatever came next. The funeral was held at the ranch, and people came from all over Montana to pay their respects. William had touched countless lives over his decades in Hecla, and the outpouring of love and respect was overwhelming. Margaret stood straight and dry-eyed through the service, accepting condolences with grace and dignity. But that night, alone in the house that suddenly felt too big and too quiet, Margaret finally allowed herself to grieve. She cried for the man who had seen her at her lowest and loved her anyway. She cried for all the years they had shared and for all the years they would not have together. She cried until she had no tears left, and then she sat in the darkness and remembered. She remembered the first time William had made her laugh, really laugh, about 2 months after she arrived in Montana. They had been working with a particularly stubborn horse who kept stealing William's hat, and the absurdity of watching this dignified man chase a horse around a corral had broken through Margaret's defenses. The sound of her own laughter had startled her, as if she had forgotten she was capable of joy. She remembered the night he proposed, the way his hands had trembled slightly as he asked her to marry him, as if he was afraid she might say no. She remembered their wedding, the way he had looked at her as she walked down the aisle, as if she were the most precious thing in the world. She remembered the birth of their children, how William had been there for both deliveries, despite it being unconventional, holding her hand and whispering encouragement. She remembered thousands of small moments, morning coffee shared on the porch, late-night conversations about everything and nothing, the way he always tucked a strand of hair behind her ear when it fell in her face, the way he sang off key when he thought no one was listening, the way he looked at her, even after 50 years, as if she still took his breath away. Margaret lived for 3 more years after William's death. They were good years in their own way. She was surrounded by family, by children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren who loved her. She continued to be active in the community, helping run the school and the boarding house. She found purpose in service, just as William had taught her. But everyone could see that part of her had gone with William. She was like a tree that had lost half its roots, still standing but not quite as stable as before. And when she passed away peacefully in her sleep on a warm June night, there was a sense that it was right, that she had held on as long as she needed to, but was ready now to rejoin her beloved husband. They buried Margaret next to William on a hill overlooking the ranch, under a sky so blue and vast it seemed to stretch into infinity. The entire family gathered for the funeral, 3 generations strong, all of them living testaments to the love Margaret and William had shared. James, now in his 50s and looking remarkably like his father, gave the eulogy. He spoke about his mother's strength, her compassion, her unwavering love for her family. He spoke about the partnership she had shared with William, how they had been true equals in every sense of the word. And he spoke about the legacy they had left, not just in the ranch or the business, but in the way they had loved each other and everyone around them. My parents taught us that love is not just a feeling, but a choice, James said, his voice thick with emotion. Every day they chose each other. Every day they chose to build something beautiful together. And because of that choice, repeated over and over across 50 years, we are all here today. We exist because they loved each other, and we thrive because they taught us how to love. After the funeral, the family gathered at the ranch house. Children and adults mingled, sharing stories and memories, laughing and crying in equal measure. And as the sun set over the Montana mountains, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink, there was a sense of peace settling over the gathering. Margaret Monroe had arrived in Hecla, Montana in 1882 as a frightened, abused young woman with nothing but a small bag and a desperate hope for something better. She had been running from a past that had tried to break her, fleeing toward an uncertain future. Instead, she had found William Kendrick, a man who saw her worth when she could not see it herself. Together, they had built a life of love, respect, and partnership. They had raised a family, prospered in business, and touched countless lives with their kindness and generosity. The scars on Margaret's back had never fully faded. Even at the end of her life, the white lines were still visible, a permanent reminder of the cruelty she had endured. But they had ceased to define her decades before. Instead, she was defined by her choices, by her courage, by the love she had shared and received. And somewhere, in whatever comes after this life, William and Margaret were together again. Two souls who had found each other against impossible odds, who had chosen each other every day for 50 years, finally reunited. The mail-order bride with whip marks down her back and the cowboy who had traced them and sworn vengeance had found their happy ending, both in life and beyond. Their legacy lived on in the ranch that still bore the Kendrick name, in the horses that carried their bloodlines, in the school that educated generations of Montana children, and most importantly, in the family they had created together. Every child born to the Kendrick family carried forward the lessons Margaret and William had taught, that love is a choice, that courage can overcome any obstacle, and that even the darkest past can give way to a bright future if you are willing to fight for it. The story of the mail-order bride and the cowboy who saved her became something of a legend in Hecla, passed down through generations. Details were embellished, facts became blurred with fiction, but the core truth remained. True love, the kind that changes lives and builds legacies, is worth fighting for. Always,